wheelchair was new. That was the thing that broke her. Not the papers on the table, not the lawyer's voice reading numbers she no longer recognized as her own life, but the fact that the wheelchair was new and Gerald wouldn't even look at it. She had only been using it for 6 weeks. The left leg had finally stopped cooperating in November, and after 3 days of pretending otherwise, she had let her home health aide, a kind young woman named Priscilla, help her order it online. It was steel gray with padded armrests, and it had taken Miriam 4 days to stop hating it. She had just started to make peace with it, and now she was sitting in it in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet, watching the man she had been married to for 26 years sign his name on a document she had never agreed to. Gerald kept his eyes on the papers. His pen moved smoothly, the way a man's hand moves when he has practiced the signature many times in private. Across the room, just beyond the frosted glass partition, Miriam could hear someone laughing light, easy laughter, the kind that belongs to people with no appointment scheduled, no grief pending. It made the fluorescent hum above her head feel louder. The lawyer, Gerald's lawyer, not hers, she couldn't yet afford hers, slid a summary across the table without meeting her eyes. The joint account had been closed in September. The disability settlement, the $94,000 that had taken her 3 years to fight for, had been transferred out of her personal account in 2 separate withdrawals in August and October. Both withdrawals bore her signature, or something close enough to it that the bank had not questioned it. She stared at the number on the page. Then she stared at the wall behind it. Gerald finally looked up. For one moment, just one, she thought she saw something cross his face, something that might have once been the man she married. Then it passed, the way weather passes, and his face returned to the polite blankness of a stranger. She did not cry. She had cried for 6 months already. Alone in a house that no longer felt like hers, and she had run dry somewhere around October. What she felt now was quieter and heavier than tears. It was the feeling of a door closing on a room you will never see again. She didn't know it yet, but she was wrong about that. Somewhere in Harlan County, behind a wall no one had touched in 11 years, something was waiting for her. It had always been waiting. Miriam Lorette Calloway was born on a Tuesday in March of 1953 in a house that no longer exists, on a hillside that does. The house was a 4-room white clapboard structure her father, Earl Calloway, had built himself the year before her birth. Hammering every nail by hand on evenings after his shift at the coal processing plant in Harlan. It had a front porch that tilted slightly to the left, a kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee and bacon grease, and windows so thin that in winter the frost grew on the inside of the glass in patterns that looked, to a small girl lying in bed, like ferns. Miriam would press her fingertip to those frost ferns every morning before her feet hit the cold floor. It was the first beautiful thing she did each day, and she did it until she was 12 years old and her father finally replaced the windows. Earl Calloway was a quiet man who expressed love through practicality. He fixed things. He showed up. He taught Miriam to change a tire when she was 14 and to read a deed when she was 16, sitting at the kitchen table with a county record spread between them like a map to somewhere important. Her mother, Ruth, was the other half of that equation, warm where Earl was reserved. Expressive where he was careful, the kind of woman who left notes in your coat pocket for you to find in February that said things like you are loved more than you know. Between the two of them, Miriam grew up understanding that the world could be hard and that she was equipped for it. She had one sibling, a sister, 6 years younger, named Darlene. Even then, even in the early years, Darlene was different, not in any way that a stranger would have noticed, but in the way that a sister notices, slowly, over years of shared bedrooms and dinner tables. Darlene wanted what other people had, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a deep and restless hunger that no amount of having ever seemed to satisfy. She wanted the prettier dress, the better seat, the more interesting story. She would listen to Miriam talk about her day, and then, somehow, by the end of the conversation, the story would belong to Darlene. Ruth called it imagination. Earl said nothing. Miriam learned, quietly, to keep certain things to herself. She was a good student, not brilliant in the way that announces itself, but steady and thorough. The kind of student whose teachers wrote things like Miriam thinks before she speaks on her report cards, which was meant as a compliment and was. She loved biology. She loved the logic of the body, the way every system had a purpose and every purpose had a name. After high school, she enrolled at Eastern Kentucky University on a partial academic scholarship, working 20 hours a week at the university library to cover the rest, eating peanut butter sandwiches 4 nights a week without complaint because she understood that this was the cost of the life she was building. It was at ECU that she decided on occupational therapy. She had volunteered 1 semester at a rehabilitation center in Richmond as part of a health sciences requirement, and on her 3rd visit, she watched a man in his 50s, a former electrician, who had suffered a severe stroke, successfully button the top button of his flannel shirt for the first time since his hospitalization. He stared at his own hand for a long moment afterward. Then, he looked up at the therapist beside him, and his eyes filled, and he said nothing, because he didn't need to. Miriam stood in the doorway watching and felt something settle inside her chest like a key finding its lock. She knew, from that afternoon forward, exactly what she was meant to do. She graduated in 1975 and returned to Harlan County, which surprised people who expected her to leave. She took a position at Harlan R Hospital and within 3 years had built a small but deeply trusted reputation. Patients requested her by name. Colleagues borrowed her patients when their own ran out. She was the therapist who stayed late not because she was told to, but because she could not leave a patient mid-struggle. She carried that ethic for 31 years without once burning out, which was either a gift or a testament to how precisely she had chosen her work. Gerald Vanson came into her life in the autumn of 1981 at a church potluck dinner at Grace Baptist, which neither of them particularly wanted to attend. He had been dragged by his cousin. She had been asked by Ruth, who believed that casseroles and community were the solutions to most problems. Gerald was 32, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a way of listening that Miriam noticed immediately. He listened with his whole face, not just his ears, and when she said something, he considered it before responding, which was, in her experience, rarer than it should have been. They talked for 2 hours beside a folding table covered in slow cooker dishes and paper plates. He told her he was a civil engineer working for the county road department. She told him about the electrician and the button. He was quiet for a moment after that, and then he said, "That's the most human thing I've ever heard." And she laughed and thought, well, that's that then. They were married in June of 1983. The ceremony was at Grace Baptist, small and warm, with Ruth crying from the second pew and Earl shaking Gerald's hand twice, which was Earl's version of a standing ovation. Miriam wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and a dress she had made herself over 4 weekends, ivory cotton with a lace collar. and she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, feeling like a woman who had made every right decision. The reception was in Ruth's backyard, strung with lights, and someone brought a fiddle, and Gerald danced badly and without embarrassment. And Miriam decided in that moment that she would love him for the rest of her life. For many years, that decision held. They built their life in the brick house on the edge of Loyal. Gerald's career grew steadily. Miriam's reputation at the hospital deepened. They planted a garden every May: tomatoes, pole beans, cucumbers, herbs, and canned what they grew in late August, the kitchen filling with steam and the sweet, sharp smell of tomatoes breaking down in the stock pot. They took one vacation a year, always driving, always somewhere they had never been. They argued occasionally, made up thoroughly, and moved forward. They tried for children in their early years, and it didn't happen, which Miriam grieved privately and Gerald never fully understood how to hold. And that was the first small silence between them, not a wound. Exactly. But a place where something tender lived that they never quite learned to touch together. They lost Earl in 1994, a heart attack at 69, sudden and complete. Miriam handled it the way she handled most pain, by staying useful, by organizing the funeral, by sitting with Ruth every evening for 3 months until her mother's grief found a shape it could carry. 2 years later, Miriam's closest colleague and friend, a woman named Bet Sizemore, died of ovarian cancer at 51, and Miriam sat with her in the hospital on her final night, holding her hand in the dark, listening to her breathe. She had known grief before. She knew how to survive it. Ruth died in 1998. Lung cancer, quiet and fast, the way Ruth had always preferred to do difficult things. She left the limestone cottage on Clover Fork Road to Miriam, only to Miriam. Specifically and in writing, having purchased it in the 1960s under her maiden name as a private investment property she had never quite gotten around to selling. The deed had been recorded decades ago under R.M. Calloway, and Ruth had kept the document box olive green, military style. The combination lock set to a number only Miriam would know in the back of the storage closet at the cottage. Miriam had visited the property once after the funeral, stood in the doorway for a long time, and then closed the door gently and driven home. It was too much Ruth, all at once. She told herself she would go back when she was ready. She was not ready for a long time. Gerald never showed much interest in the cottage. It was overgrown, he said. Probably not worth the taxes. Miriam paid those taxes every year from her own account without discussion, the way she paid for quiet things that mattered to her. She never added Gerald's name to the deed. There was no particular reason she didn't. She simply never got around to it, and then she forgot about it, and then life moved on, the way life does. In 2019, Miriam was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis following a year of symptoms that 2 separate physicians had dismissed as stress and aging. The delay cost her. By the time the diagnosis came, documented and undeniable, irreversible neurological damage had already been done, damage that a timely diagnosis might have slowed. She filed a malpractice case, which took 3 years and cost her more emotionally than she had expected. And in 2022, she received a settlement of $94,000, which she deposited into her personal account on a Wednesday afternoon in July, driving home feeling exhausted and relieved and cautiously grateful. Gerald had been quiet for a long time by then. Not hostile, not unkind, just quiet in a way that had a shape to it, a deliberate quality. Like a room where something has been removed and no one has mentioned it yet. She noticed. She filed it away, She told herself it was the stress of her illness, of the years of uncertainty, of watching her body become something she had to negotiate with rather than simply inhabit. She was being generous. She was always being generous. That was the last mistake she made. The first sign was a phone call she was not supposed to hear. It was a Thursday evening in late January of 2023, and Miriam was in the hallway outside the kitchen, moving slowly with her cane toward the bedroom, when she heard Gerald's voice through the partially open back door. He was on the porch. She could see the pale rectangle of his phone screen through the gap, the orange tip of the cigarette he had supposedly quit 3 years ago, glowing in the cold. She stopped not because she intended to listen, but because her left leg had decided, in that particular moment, not to cooperate. And she steadied herself against the wall and waited. Gerald was laughing. It was not the laugh she knew, the slightly reluctant, building laugh he produced when something genuinely surprised him. This was looser, warmer, the laugh of a man completely at ease. She heard him say, "She doesn't know anything about it. She never goes in there." A pause. Then, softer, almost tender, "I know. I know." Not much longer. She stood in the hallway for a long time after he came back inside. He passed her on the way to the kitchen, kissed the top of her head with the automatic affection of long habit, and asked if she wanted chamomile tea. She said yes. She sat at the kitchen table and watched him fill the kettle and thought about the tone of his voice on that porch, the specific warmth of it, the ease, the intimacy, and she understood with the clarity of a woman who had spent 31 years reading what people's bodies said when their mouths said something else, that she was hearing him be happy, and that the happiness had nothing to do with her. She did not confront him that night. She told herself she needed to be sure. In truth, she was terrified of being sure. She found out about Darlene on a Sunday in March. It was not dramatic. There was no single devastating revelation. It was a text message that appeared on Gerald's phone while it was charging on the kitchen counter, and he was in the shower, a message that she saw by accident when she reached past it to get her own phone from the same counter. The screen lit as her hand passed over it. She saw Darlene's name. She saw 4 words of the message before the screen went dark. 4 words were enough. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long time. She could hear the shower running. She could hear the birds outside a cardinal, persistent and oblivious, calling from the pine tree in the side yard. The kitchen smelled of the coffee she had made an hour ago, still warm in the pot, ordinary and domestic and completely unchanged. Everything was completely unchanged. Only she was different now, standing in the middle of her own kitchen, like a woman who has just walked into a room she does not recognize. Her sister, Gerald and her sister. She did not confront him that day either. She was in a wheelchair by then, some days, and she understood instinctively with the practical intelligence of a woman who has always known that the vulnerable must be strategic, that she needed information before she needed confrontation. She needed to understand the shape of what had been done before she revealed that she understood anything at all. What she discovered over the following 6 weeks was worse than the betrayal itself. She had a friend, a retired paralegal named Connie Marsh, who had helped her navigate her malpractice case and who owed her, in the quiet economy of deep friendship, more than either of them would ever say aloud. Miriam called Connie on a Tuesday morning while Gerald was at the county road office. She told her everything in a single flat recitation. The way a patient describes symptoms to a doctor's specific, sequential, without editorial. Connie listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Miriam, I need you to get me access to every financial account you have joint access to." Today, what Connie found took 4 days to document and made her set down her reading glasses and press her fingers to her eyes when she called Miriam back. The joint savings account, the one Miriam and Gerald had maintained for 22 years, which had held $41. $200 as of the previous October had been drawn down to $4,300 through a series of withdrawals beginning in November. Each withdrawal was under the federal reporting threshold. They had been made at the branch in Cumberland, 20 miles from Loyal, at a teller window rather than online. Using Gerald's access, the money had moved to an account Connie could not directly trace, but whose routing pattern suggested a new individual account opened in the same quarter in a different name. The disability settlement was the one that took Miriam's breath away. The $94,000 she had received in July had been held in her personal checking account, not a joint account, her account, in her name alone. And yet in August, $47,000 had been withdrawn via a signed transfer authorization. In October, another $44,500 had followed through the same mechanism. The remaining $2,500 had been paid to a utility company, a detail so mundane it was almost insulting. Both transfer authorizations bore Miriam's signature. Miriam had signed neither of them. When Connie told her this, Miriam sat in her wheelchair in the living room of her own house and felt the room tilt gently, like a boat finding a new current. Her hands in her lap were absolutely still. Outside, the cardinal was still in the pine tree. She hated that cardinal suddenly, fiercely, for its total indifference. She tried to fight back. She went to the bank Connie drove her, because her own hands were shaking too badly that morning, and she sat across from the branch manager, a young man with a careful tie and no expression. And she explained what she believed had happened to her money. He listened. He pulled the records. He looked at the signatures for a long time without saying anything. Then he said he would need to refer the matter to the fraud department and that the process could take 60 to 90 days and that in the meantime there was nothing he could do about the current balance. 60 to 90 days. She went home and told Gerald none of this. She sat across from him at dinner that night, pork chops, the kind she had been making for 20 years, because she had not yet had the presence of mind to change anything, and she watched him eat and talk about a road project in Lynch, and she thought about the $91, $500 that had disappeared from an account that bore only her name. She thought about Darlene's number in his phone. She thought about the voice on the porch not much longer, and she understood that she was watching a plan in its final stages. She was the last item on a checklist. The divorce filing came in April. Gerald moved out on a Wednesday, taking the truck, the flat-screen television from the bedroom, and a duffel bag that she noticed, with a detached precision she would later find strange, was already packed before he announced he was leaving. He said he was sorry. He said it in the tone of a man who had rehearsed the word until it lost all its content. He said he and Darlene had been friends for years, and that feelings had developed, and that he hadn't planned for any of this, which was so clearly and demonstrably false that Miriam could not even find the energy to contradict it. She said nothing. She watched him carry his bag to the truck. He paused at the door. He said, "I hope you know I still care about you, Miriam." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had danced badly at their wedding, who had listened with his whole face, who had once called her story about a man and a button the most human thing he had ever heard, and she felt something finalize inside her, like a closing, like a seal. She said, "I know exactly what you care about, Gerald." He left. The door settled in its frame. The house was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator running in the kitchen. She did not hear from Darlene. Not a call, not a message, not a letter. The sister who had always wanted what Miriam had simply took it and went silent, the way a hand withdraws after it has taken what it reached for. That silence, somehow, was its own particular cruelty. It required no confrontation, no explanation, no acknowledgement that Miriam was a person to whom something was owed. The legal process was slow and expensive and grinding. Gerald's attorney was aggressive in a way that suggested significant preparation. He had documentation, timelines, asset disclosures that had clearly been assembled over months. The disability settlement was characterized through some mechanism Miriam's own attorney was still untangling as having been voluntarily transferred prior to the divorce filing, which placed it outside the marital estate dispute and made recovery a separate civil matter that would take longer and cost more than Miriam currently had the resources to sustain. The joint savings account was presented as mutually depleted through shared household expenses. The numbers were tidy. The story was complete. She had no counter evidence that was ready. Her fraud complaint was still pending. Her attorney, a decent man named Wallace Pruitt, no relation. A coincidence that made her laugh once, briefly, in a way that had nothing to do with humor, told her they needed more time. More time cost more money she did not have. By midsummer, she was living on her disability benefits and a small pension from her 31 years at the hospital. In a house she could no longer afford to heat fully, in a wheelchair she had finally stopped hating, simply because she no longer had the energy for it. Her garden went unplanted that spring for the first time in 2 decades. The soil in the raised beds turned gray and cracked in the July heat. And she looked at it from the back window one afternoon and felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Not grief, not anger, but the deep, flat exhaustion of a person who has been completely emptied. She thought about Ruth. She thought about what her mother would have said. Sitting across from her at a kitchen table, pressing her hand. She thought about the notes in coat pockets, the specific faith Ruth had carried for her daughters. She could not, in that moment, find a single reason that faith was warranted. She was wrong, but she did not know that yet. She was as low as she had ever been, and the night felt total, and she was completely alone. It was a water bill that started everything. In the second week of September, Miriam received a notice from the Harlan County Property Tax Office, forwarded twice, dog-eared and slightly damp, as though it had traveled a long way to find her, informing her that the annual property tax on the Clover Fork Road parcel was 11 months overdue and that a lien would be placed on the property if payment was not received within 30 days. The amount owed was $340. She stared at the notice for a long moment, and then she set it on the kitchen table beside her cold coffee, and something shifted in her chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the small, involuntary alertness of a person who has just heard a sound in a room they thought was empty. She had not thought about the cottage in years, not since Ruth's funeral. Not since she had stood in its doorway for 5 minutes in 1998 and then closed the door on all that grief and driven back to Loyal and gotten on with the business of surviving. She had paid the taxes every year from habit and duty and the automated loyalty of a daughter. The payments coming out of her personal account in October like clockwork, and she had never once thought about what the property actually meant or what it actually contained or what her mother had actually left her there. Connie drove her to Harlan County on a Friday morning. The sky low and pale gray, the kind of September sky that can't decide between summer and autumn and settles for neither. The drive took 40 minutes through country that grew wilder and more vertical as they left the main highway limestone ridges pressing in on both sides, the road narrowing. The trees thickening until the light came through in long pale columns between the branches. Miriam watched it from the passenger window and felt, without being able to name it precisely, that she was traveling toward something rather than simply traveling. Clover Fork Road was gravel for its last quarter mile. Connie's sedan moved over it slowly, the stones clicking against the undercarriage, the overgrown sumac and wild blackberry closing in on both sides until the cottage appeared around a long, curved, small stone built. Its limestone walls darkened with age and moisture, the front porch sagging slightly on the left side, the garden beds consumed entirely by goldenrod and pokeweed. The windows were intact. The roof, remarkably, appeared sound. A massive red oak stood in the side yard, its roots pressing up through the ground in long arching ridges, its canopy so wide it threw half the property into deep green shade. Miriam sat in the passenger seat for a long moment after Connie stopped the car. She could smell, even through the closed window, the particular smell of that valley-damp limestone, fallen leaves beginning to break down, the faint mineral sweetness of the creek that ran somewhere behind the tree line. It was the smell of her childhood. It was the smell of Ruth. She got out of the car and stood with her cane on the gravel and looked at the cottage and felt grief move through her, clean and complete. The way grief sometimes does when you have finally allowed yourself to stand in front of the thing that holds it. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "All right, Mama, I'm here." The front door key was where Ruth had always kept it, under the flat gray stone to the left of the porch steps. A hiding place so obvious it had outlasted 30 years, simply because no one in Harlan County would bother breaking into a property this remote. The lock was stiff, resistant, and then yielded with a sound like a held breath releasing. The door swung inward. The air inside was close and cool, carrying the particular stillness of a room that has been sealed for a long time dust, old wood. Something faintly floral that might have been the ghost of Ruth's hand lotion, or might have been imagination. The furniture was covered in white sheets that had gone gray with age. The floorboards were pine, wide and dark, solid underfoot. Light came through the south window in a long rectangle that lay across the covered settee like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. Miriam moved through the room slowly. The kitchen, small and practical, Ruth's cast iron skillet still hanging on its hook beside the stove. The back bedroom, its window looking out toward the creek, a patchwork quilt on the bed frame still folded at the foot as though someone had just smoothed it there. Every room was a sentence her mother had left unfinished, and Miriam walked through each one and let herself feel the weight of it without stepping back from it. The storage closet was at the end of the short hallway, its door swollen slightly in its frame from years of humidity. She had to lean her shoulder into it to open it, and when it gave way, she stumbled half a step forward and caught herself on the doorframe and stood there breathing, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The closet was narrow and deeper than she remembered. 3 wooden shelves on the left held old canning jars, a rusted toolbox, folded burlap sacks, a cardboard box of yellowed paperbacks. To the right, hanging on hooks, were Ruth's old work coats, still carrying the shape of her shoulders after all these years. The smell in here was different cedar, rust, the dry mineral scent of old paper. Miriam stood in the doorway and looked at the back wall. She almost missed it. The back wall was paneled in the same pine board as the hallway floor, and where the paneling met the right-hand corner, it did not quite meet flush. There was a seam, not a gap exactly, more a shadow, the kind of imperfection that registers in peripheral vision before the conscious mind has processed it. Miriam looked at it for a long moment. Then she stepped forward, past Ruth's coats, the wool brushing her arm, rough and familiar. Smelling of cedar and cold weather, and she pressed her palm flat against the panel beside the seam. It moved. It moved perhaps a quarter inch. A slight give under her hand, and she heard the soft resistance of a panel that had been designed to open. Her hand was trembling. She was aware of her hand trembling, and she could not stop it. She pressed more firmly, working her fingers along the seam, and the panel swung inward on a simple pivot hinge, revealing a recess in the wall approximately 18 inches wide and 2 feet deep, built into the space between the studs. Inside the recess, sitting on a small wooden shelf, was an olive green tin box. It was military style, the kind sold at Army surplus stores in the 1960s, with reinforced corners and a combination lock on the front hasp. The paint was worn at the edges, but the box was intact, dust-filmed but solid. Utterly undamaged by the years, a strip of masking tape on the lid bore 3 words in Ruth's handwriting, small, neat, deliberate, for Miriam only. She stood there looking at it for a long time. She did not reach for it immediately. She stood with her hand on the open panel and looked at her mother's handwriting and felt the full weight of what those 3 words meant, the specific intention of them. The care with which they had been written by a woman who had known, somehow, that there would come a time when Miriam needed something that was only and entirely hers. A woman who had prepared for that time without telling anyone. A woman who had sealed something away in a hidden wall and trusted that her daughter would find it when she needed it. She was crying before she reached for the box. She did not know when she had started. The combination was her mother's birthday. March 4th, 0304, she turned the dial with fingers that would not stop shaking right, left, right, the mechanical click of each number finding its position, and on the 3rd rotation, the hasp released with a sound so clean and final, it seemed to echo in the small closet. She stood holding the closed box for a moment, feeling its weight, the faint coolness of the metal through her palms. Then she sat down on the closet floor, simply folded herself down, back against the door frame, legs out in front of her, because she needed to be closer to the ground for this, and she opened it. The first thing she saw was a manila envelope, thick and sealed with a metal clasp. Labeled in Ruth's handwriting, Property Deed Clover Fork Road, RM, Callaway paid in full. Beneath it, a thinner envelope containing tax payment records going back to 1987, each one stamped and dated by the Harlan County Clerk's office, a perfect, unbroken chain of documentation. Beneath that, a folded document she recognized immediately as a certified copy of the original deed recorded under Ruth's maiden name in the 60s, in ink that had faded to brown at the edges, bearing the legal description of the parcel, the acreage, the precise boundaries. The deed bore only one name in the ownership line, Ruth M. Callaway, and below that, in a separate transfer notation dated 1998, conveyed in full to Miriam Lorette Callaway Vanson, sole owner, no encumbrances. Sole owner, no encumbrances. She read those words 3 times. Her lips moved. The closet was absolutely silent, except for the sound of her own breathing, which had become slow and deliberate, the breathing of a person managing something enormous. She set the deed aside and reached for the last item in the box. It was a letter, a white envelope, sealed, her name written on the front in Ruth's handwriting, the particular looping cursive of a woman who had learned penmanship in the 1940s, each letter formed with the careful attention of someone who believed that how you wrote a person's name said something about how you regarded them. Miriam held it in both hands. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges. Her mother had sealed this envelope in 1998, and no one had opened it in the 26 years since. She opened it slowly, the way you open something you are not sure you are strong enough to receive. The letter was 2 pages, written on Ruth's pale blue stationery, the kind with the small violets printed at the top. Her handwriting was steady. This had been written before the illness had taken hold, in a period when Ruth still had her full strength, and the letters were clear and unhurried. My darling Miriam, it began. If you are reading this, then you have found what I left for you, which means you needed to find it, and I am glad I thought to put it here. She had to stop reading for a moment. She pressed the letter against her chest and looked up at the closet ceiling bare pine boards, a single nail, a cobweb trembling slightly in the air, disturbed by the open panel, and she breathed. She read on. Ruth wrote that she had bought the Clover Fork cottage in 1962 with money she had saved for 11 years, quietly, from her household allowance and her part-time work at the dry goods store, because she believed that a woman should have something that was entirely her own in this world, something no circumstance could dissolve. She wrote that she had always intended to give it to Miriam because she had seen in Miriam, from the time she was very small, a woman who would need a place to stand when the ground shifted. You have always been the one who holds everything together for everyone else, Ruth wrote. I wanted to make sure something was holding you. She wrote that the deed was in Miriam's name alone and had never been part of any joint estate, and that the taxes were paid through 1998, and that Miriam should keep paying them quietly and keep the box where it was until she needed it. She wrote near the end of the second page, in handwriting that had grown slightly larger and slower, as though the words were difficult to finish, do not let anyone tell you that you have nothing left. You always have this, and you always have yourself. Those 2 things are enough to begin again. The last line of the letter was simply, all my love, forever and always, Mama. Miriam sat on the closet floor of the cottage on Clover Fork Road for a long time after she finished reading. The afternoon light had shifted while she sat there, and now came through the hallway window at a lower angle, reaching the closet doorway in a long warm stripe across the pine floor. Somewhere outside, the red oak moved in a wind she couldn't feel from inside, and she could hear its leaves still green, not yet turned to sound like the gentlest kind of applause. She held her mother's letter in both hands and understood fully and completely what Gerald and Darlene had missed. They had gone through every account, every asset, every document they could access. They had been thorough and deliberate, and they had taken almost everything. But they had never known about a limestone cottage on a gravel road recorded under a maiden name in a county clerk's office from 1962. They had never thought to look for a false panel in a storage closet that smelled of cedar and old wool. They had never imagined that a woman they had written off completely might have had a mother who loved her well enough to prepare for exactly this. Gerald had taken $135,000 from her. Ruth had left her a property worth $187,000, clear of every encumbrance, belonging to no one but Miriam. She had not lost. She had simply not yet found what she had. She pressed her mother's letter one more time to her chest, feeling the slight crinkle of the blue stationery against her sternum. Feeling the coolness of the tin box in her lap, she thought about Ruth. She thought about those frost ferns on the winter windows and her fingertip pressing into them every morning, and the first beautiful thing she had done each day for the first 12 years of her life. She thought about surviving. She thought about what it meant to begin again. Then she called Connie in from the car. Connie sat on the covered settee in the front room of the cottage with her reading glasses on and the deed in both hands, and she did not say anything for a very long time. The sheet that had covered the settee lay folded on the floor beside her feet. Dust motes moved in the pale afternoon light above her head. Miriam sat across from her in the wingback chair she had uncovered by the window, Ruth's letter folded in her coat pocket, her hand resting on top of it, the way a person rests a hand on something they need to keep knowing is real. Connie finally set the deed down on her knee and took off her reading glasses and looked at Miriam over them. She said, "Gerald never filed this property in the asset disclosure." Miriam said, "No." Connie said, "Because he didn't know it existed." Miriam said, "No, he didn't." Connie put her glasses back on and picked up the deed again and read the transfer notation one more time, conveyed in full to Miriam Lorette Calloway Vanson, sole owner. No encumbrances, and then she set it down very carefully on the cushion beside her, the way you set down something that has become suddenly valuable, and she looked at Miriam and said, "Honey, I need you to let me make a phone call." The attorney Connie called was not Wallace Pruitt. She called a woman named Sandra Beckett, a property and family law attorney out of Lexington, who had a reputation, Connie explained on the drive back to Loyal that evening, for being very calm in courtrooms and very unpleasant for opposing counsel to deal with. Miriam listened to this description with the particular appreciation of a woman who had spent several months being handled carelessly by people who had assumed she had no remaining leverage. She met Sandra Beckett the following Tuesday at her office in Lexington, a clean, spare room on the 4th floor of a building on Main Street with tall windows and no clutter. The kind of office that communicated without saying a word that its occupant did not waste time. Sandra was 60, with silver hair cut close and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. And she reviewed the deed, the tax records, and the transfer notation with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who already understood what she was looking at and was simply confirming it. When she finished, she set the documents on the desk, aligned them with a small, precise motion, and said, "This property was never part of the marital estate. It was conveyed to you as sole owner before your marriage had any legal claim to it under Kentucky statute. It was never titled jointly. It was never disclosed in the divorce proceedings because your husband was unaware of its existence. It is yours. Completely and without contest." She paused. "And it substantially changes the character of the financial picture in this divorce." Miriam said, "How substantially?" Sandra said, "Substantially enough that I would like to file a motion to reopen asset discovery by the end of this week." The appraisal was ordered the same week. A property assessor named Dennis Coyle drove out to Clover Fork Road on a Thursday morning and spent 2 hours walking the parcel, measuring the structure, examining the roof and the foundation and the limestone walls. He noted the red oak. He noted the creek access at the back of the property. He noted the soundness of the construction, which was, he told Miriam afterward, standing in the gravel drive, better than most things built in the last 40 years because limestone does not lie about its own integrity. His written appraisal arrived 10 days later. The current fair market value of the property, accounting for the land, the structure, and the creek access, was $187,500. Miriam read that number at her kitchen table in Loyal with her morning coffee and felt something move through her that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but something older and quieter than either the feeling of a foundation holding under weight it was always designed to carry. Sandra filed the motion on a Friday. The motion cited the newly discovered asset, the property deed, the unbroken tax record, and the fact that the asset had been omitted from Gerald's disclosure, not through Miriam's concealment, but through Gerald's genuine ignorance of its existence, which Sandra noted in language that was calm and precise and quietly devastating, raised significant questions about the thoroughness and good faith of the asset disclosure process as a whole. She attached a supplementary filing citing the pending bank fraud complaint regarding the disability settlement withdrawals, the timeline of those withdrawals relative to Gerald and Darlene's relationship, and the pattern of financial transfers that Connie had documented over the preceding months. Gerald's attorney called Sandra's office within 48 hours of receiving the filing. Miriam was not present for that conversation, but Sandra relayed its content to her the following morning with the composed neutrality of a woman who had heard many versions of that particular conversation before. The attorney had characterized the motion as procedurally aggressive. Sandra had agreed that it was. The attorney had suggested the matter might be resolved more efficiently through a revised settlement negotiation. Sandra had said she was open to that discussion and had named a number. The number was $187,000. It represented the full appraised value of the cottage to be paid to Miriam in lieu of the property being liquidated, with an additional structured settlement addressing the disability funds that had been withdrawn from her personal account funds that Sandra had now formally characterized in the supplementary filing as fraudulently transferred, a characterization that Gerald's own attorney had not, notably, contested with any particular energy. Gerald signed the revised settlement on a Wednesday morning in November. Miriam was not in the room. She had decided, with Sandra's full support, that she did not need to be. She was at the cottage on Clover Fork Road when Sandra called her with the confirmation, standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea she had made on Ruth's old stove, which had required 40 minutes of cleaning and a new igniter, but had lit on the first try once it was ready. The blue flame rising clean and steady under the kettle. She heard Sandra's voice say it's done, and she stood in her mother's kitchen with the phone against her ear and looked out the window at the red oak in the side yard, its leaves gone gold and copper now, moving in the November wind against a sky the color of pewter, and she said thank you in a voice that was entirely steady. She had given notice on the Loyal house in October. She could not afford to keep it and did not particularly want to it had become in the years since Gerald left. A structure she inhabited rather than a home she lived in, and there is a difference between those two things that a person feels in the bones. She hired 2 men from a local moving company to bring her furniture to the cottage, and Connie came and helped her unpack. And they worked for 2 days side by side, unwrapping dishes and hanging curtains and sliding furniture into positions that slowly began to feel, with each adjustment, like decisions rather than accidents. The bedroom window looked out toward the creek. On her first morning at the cottage, Miriam woke before dawn and lay in the dark listening to the water, a sound she had forgotten existed. Continuous and unhurried, moving over the stones in the dark with the complete indifference of something that has never needed to be anything other than what it is. The room smelled of cedar and the faint mineral sweetness of the limestone walls, and when the light began to come up through the window, it came slowly, filtering through the red oak, arriving in pieces rather than all at once, and she lay in it and breathed and did not move for a long time. She learned later, through Connie, who had heard it from a mutual acquaintance in Harlan, that Gerald and Darlene had been told about the revised settlement and its terms by Gerald's attorney in a phone call on the same Wednesday Miriam was standing in the cottage kitchen. Connie relayed what she had heard with the careful neutrality of a good friend who knows the difference between information and gloating, and Miriam listened with the same neutrality and said only, "I see." What she felt was not satisfaction. Exactly not the sharp pleasure of a score settled, but something more like the quiet resolution of a chord that has been unfinished for too long. The sound of a thing finally completing itself. Gerald and Darlene had, apparently, not anticipated this outcome. This was unsurprising. People who plan carefully for what they intend to take rarely plan for what they have missed. The concrete consequence came in January, when the bank fraud investigation, the one that had been pending for 60 to 90 days and had stretched, as these things do, to nearly 8 months, issued its preliminary findings. The findings cited 2 fraudulent transfer authorizations bearing signatures that did not match Miriam's authenticated signature samples, executed during a period when Gerald had sole physical access to her personal account documentation. The bank restored $62,000 to Miriam's account as an initial recovery and forwarded the findings to the Kentucky State Police Financial Crimes Unit for further review. Gerald received a certified letter informing him of the referral on a Thursday morning in late January. Connie, who still had contacts in the county clerk's world, heard about his response secondhand and reported it to Miriam with a brevity that was more eloquent than any elaboration could have been. He didn't take it well. Miriam said, "No, I don't suppose he did." She planted the garden in April. She started small tomatoes in 3 varieties. Pole beans along the back fence she had repaired herself over 2 March weekends, moving slowly but working steadily, the cold soil dark and damp under her gloved hands. She had not expected gardening to work differently in a wheelchair. She had expected it to be harder, diminished, a compromise, but she found that working close to the ground gave her a perspective she had not previously had. A closeness to the soil that felt less like limitation and more like intimacy. She pressed tomato seedlings into the earth and patted the soil firm around their roots, and felt, with each one, the specific satisfaction of planting something you intend to see through. She had her mother's cast iron skillet back on its hook beside the stove. She had Ruth's patchwork quilt on the bed frame, smooth flat each morning. She had the tin box on the shelf in the hallway, empty now, its documents filed with Sandra's office and with the county clerk, but kept because it was the shape of what had saved her, and she was not yet ready to put it away. On the wall beside the front door, she had hung the small framed photograph she had found in the bottom of one of her moving boxes, a picture of Ruth in this same yard, standing under the red oak in what appeared to be the early 1970s, one hand raised to shade her eyes, smiling at whoever held the camera with the easy confidence of a woman entirely at home. Every morning, Miriam made coffee in Ruth's kitchen and sat at the table by the window and watched the light change on the creek and felt, in the specific and unremarkable texture of each ordinary morning, that she was not surviving her life, but living it. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything. On a morning in early May, Miriam Lorette Vanson sat on the repaired front porch of the limestone cottage on Clover Fork Road and drank her coffee while the valley woke up around her. The tomatoes were coming in strong. The pole beans had climbed halfway up the back fence overnight, it seemed, the way beans do in May when the soil finally commits to warmth. The red oak threw its wide shadow across the yard, and a pair of wrens had built a nest somewhere in its upper branches and were conducting their morning business with great urgency and no concern whatsoever for Miriam's presence below. The creek, invisible behind the tree line, moved over its stones in its continuous, unhurried way. The air smelled of wet earth and something blooming she couldn't quite name, something sweet and faintly wild. The smell of a valley doing what valleys do when no one is managing them. She was 72 years old. She lived alone in her mother's house. She grew her own tomatoes and paid her own taxes and made her own decisions about every single thing, down to which window to open first in the morning and which coat to wear when the weather couldn't make up its mind. These were not small things. She had learned in the hardest possible way that they were not small things at all. She thought sometimes about the conference room, the burnt coffee smell, the fluorescent hum, the new wheelchair she had just made peace with, and Gerald's eyes on the papers, and the sound of someone laughing behind the frosted glass, easy laughter, unburdened laughter, the laughter of people with nowhere particular to be. She had sat in that room and felt a door close on a room she would never see again. She had been wrong about the door. She had been wrong about the room. What she had not known, sitting in that conference room in her gray wheelchair with her hands in her lap, was that her mother had spent 36 years quietly building her a way back, had sealed it in a tin box behind a hidden panel in a closet that smelled of cedar and old wool, and had written her name on the outside and had trusted her to find it. You have always been the one who holds everything together for everyone else. I wanted to make sure something was holding you. She set her coffee cup down on the porch railing and looked out at the yard, at the garden, at the oak, at the goldenrod coming up along the fence line in the places she hadn't yet cleared, the places she was leaving wild on purpose, because wildness, she had decided, deserved some room. A woman who has spent 31 years helping people reclaim what their bodies had taken from them understands, more than most, that recovery is not a straight line, and that the goal is not to return to exactly what was lost, but to find in what remains something worth building from. She had found it. It smelled of limestone and creek water and her mother's hand lotion and coffee made on an old stove that lit on the first try when it was ready. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that remind us that even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary may still be waiting.